I learned in writing that book was just how powerful it is to stand in uncertainty, to stand in the ambivalence of a context where it's not clear where things are going. And that's really where, the stories are told. That's where the nostalgia comes from. That's where memories will be created very consciously. It's not in the comfortable moments, it's not in the routine things that we do, the brushing of our teeth every day, the driving of a car, well, on Kenyan streets, that also can be uncertain. But it is really in standing in the spaces where you have an element of personal risk. There's no clarity about what might happen, but you know that you're standing there because you're standing for something that's greater than yourself. You're standing for somebody else that is at risk themselves.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Seamus Ford. I'm Landmark's Director of Community Engagement, and you're attending the Landmark Difference Makers interview series. Today, we're going to be interviewing Irũngũ Houghton, the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. With over 25 years of experience in human rights advocacy, social justice, and governance, Irũngũ is a powerful voice for equality and dignity across the region. Under his leadership, Amnesty International Kenya has championed campaigns on police accountability, women's rights, and social justice. We're excited to hear his insights on the state of human rights and how we all can make a difference. Irũngũ, I really, really thank you for being here and making the time. I know you're very busy, and it's just really a pleasure to have you here. Let's just start with you. How did you come to be the head of Amnesty International in Kenya?
I'd like to say that there was a life script from the age of 15, and this really just panned out for me. But to be honest, actually, I saw an advert in 2018, 2017, and I was really concerned about human rights violations in that moment. I still very vividly remember police officers rampaging across one of our universities and beating up students purely because they had organized a demonstration, and a officer who shot two young men and had been captured by the BBC, shooting them in full view of about 200 people in one of our urban settlements in Nairobi. And I was really struck by the precariousness, the vulnerability, the violence that you face if you live in one of our urban settlements. And when the advert came up, I very happily applied for that position.
Now, but prior to this, you had a role in with Oxfam, is that correct?
That's right. I worked for them for 10 years.
What is it about the state of human rights around the world that somebody that lives in a Western style liberal democracy might not recognize?
Well, actually, I mean, the distance between the older liberal democracies and countries like Kenya is actually narrowing much closer. I mean, I think one of my most poignant moments was in 2020, I think it was, when the Amnesty in USA director asked me to draft a letter that they could write to President Trump. So it probably is a bit later than that, actually. And they were suggesting that President Trump should speak to my president about human rights violations. And I was really struck by how ironic that was, that somebody like President Trump would be advising my president. And I said, no, let's do this. Let me write a letter to your president, and you write a letter to my president. And we ended up doing two joint letters. And I think that incident really was the turning point for me in terms of how many, global northern countries are now suffering from the very same things that we in the South have suffered for 400 years. I mean, I think the authoritarianism that we're seeing, the intolerance to diversity, the attacks on people on the basis of their identity, the levels of corruption are increasing in the global north in ways that we couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. And therefore, I think there is common cause between citizens in places like North America and Kenya, that have never been there, have never been so interesting to explore as they are now.
Well, for as somebody who's a student of history, one of the things that I think is, very self-evident now is that over the arc of human history, over the arc of human civilization, wherever you find it, civil rights and this sense of self-governance is really very new, very, very new. There's a lot more history for authoritarianism and central control than most of us would realize.
I mean, I like to see it a little bit as a tension between, freedom and authoritarianism, if you can put it that way, or constitutionalism and and authoritarianism on the other side. I think there's always been resistance. I think wherever, if you look back at the ancient empires of Egypt, of Greece, of Rome, they were always heroes and heroines that basically fought against slavery. They fought against the oppression of human beings. And therefore, every society, every generation has had the seeds of resistance embedded in it. And I think that's something that we often forget, that even in the most darkest moments of history, the reason why we can still name some of those champions is because they shone out so brightly as beacons of change and resistance. And they continue to inspire us today. I often read back into the stories of the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, the Mau Mau, as they're sometimes called, to draw inspiration, or from Wangari Maathai, or from more recently young women like Wanjira, who basically have declared that they're not frightened of police officers. They are willing to stand up and declare their freedom to speak, to assemble, to associate. And that, I think, is the enduring spirit of humanity. But of course, there's nothing predetermined by this. These are choices that people are making, as we know in Landmark. These are conscious, deliberate choices of ways of being that people are bringing, forth into societies that perhaps don't, expect it.
Well, what is Amnesty International in Kenya currently concerned for, and what are the issues that you're currently involved in?
Well, as you know, Seamus, we've had probably the most intense 6 months, definitely of my life, but probably in the history of the country for many years. I mean, the so-called Gen Z, protests that broke out in June have essentially brought the government to its knees. The June 25th storming of our parliament, the rejection of a finance bill, the dissolution of a cabinet, a government and a parliament that had to rethink how it listened or had not been listening to a population. Something like about 3 out of every 5 Kenyans are under the age of 25. This is the generation that brought the government to its knees over the last 3 to 4 months. And Amnesty's role in that space has been essentially to protect protesters. We've asserted that all Kenyans have the right to assemble, they have the right to picket, they have the right to demonstrate as long as it's non-violent. And in many cases, the protests were extremely restrained and controlled. We had thousands of young people on the streets of Nairobi without as much as, nothing more than, pocket constitutions, flags, flowers, and smartphones. And until the deliberate introduction of hooligans and goons, this was one of the most peaceful responses to misgovernance and corruption that Kenya has seen for decades. So Amnesty has spent a lot of time responding to the 60 killings by police officers. We've risen and responded to the issues of about roughly the same 70 abductions, which are unlawful under our constitution. And we've also worked on arbitrary arrests with organizations like the Law Society of Kenya, Defenders Coalition, the Kenya Human Rights Commission, the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights. We've actually worked on ensuring that thousands of young protesters are not detained arbitrarily, simply because they were expressing their dissatisfaction with this government.
As an American, in the middle of, with an election nearing, and there's famous political division in America right now. The stakes aren't the same. I mean, they're high in an election, and people are very concerned about the outcome. But the political violence that you're talking about and you're concerned for is something that I think for many people would be very intimidating. Like, what does one do in the face of the threat to what you're advocating for? And you talk about, and this is from our conversation prior to this, but you talked about engaging in uncertainty, and I'd just like you to say a little bit more about that against the backdrop of, there's life and death stakes in advocating in many of these instances.
I was talking with you earlier about the book that I worked on, Dialogue and Dissent, and one of the things that I learned in writing that book was just how powerful it is to stand in uncertainty, to stand in the ambivalence of a context where it's not clear where things are going, and that's really where the stories are told. That's where the nostalgia comes from. That's where memories will be created very consciously. It's not in the comfortable moments, it's not in the routine things that we do, the brushing of our teeth every day, the driving of a car, well, on Kenyan streets, that also can be uncertain. But it is really in standing in the spaces where you have an element of personal risk. There's no clarity about what might happen, but you know that you're standing there because you're standing for something that's greater than yourself. You're standing for somebody else that is at risk themselves. And the last 6 years of working for Amnesty International has really taught me that the greatest joys, the greatest moments in my life were just those moments of uncertainty. For us to work on protecting protesters didn't come without a degree of institutional risk. We were threatened, we were challenged at the various highest levels of our government, and it took a lot to explain to the authorities that essentially what we were doing was not to essentially create an anarchist situation. It was essentially to ensure that all players, both protesters and police officers, and the politicians, that they remained lawful, that they were guided by our constitution, and that in a moment like this, where there is great social upheaval, it is possible for truth to prevail, and also for the law to prevail, so that we are able to get through this with a respect for human rights, rather than just simply a disregard and a sense that might is right. And I think that for me has been one of the most enduring lessons of the last 6 years.
Wow. Well, just going back to what I said about being an American in the middle of an election, and this feeling of being really divided, there's a great deal of uncertainty, but I think the degree of uncertainty that you're talking about when there's the potential for political violence. If I was to describe the reticence or the fear that a lot of people have in talking about topics that they know they disagree with others on, it's a fear of losing a friendship. It's a fear of being related to a certain way, like you'll get pigeonholed in a view, and suddenly opportunities may go away for you, or people are just going to relate to you in a very fixed way. And you shared this story with me about a man that threatened your life on television, and how 10 years later you came to have him be an ally. Could you share that with us?
It's just come up on the screen there. Huh?
Oh, yes, yes.
So it's right on cue. So it's 2015. I have joined a group of people who have vowed to protect a primary school from essentially what we used to call a land grab, but the attempt to try and excise about 2.5 acres of a playground that was next to a hotel that was owned then by the deputy president. He's now the current president of Kenya. And the school went on recess. They came back, and there was this just huge wall that separated now the classrooms from the playground. And a number of us decided that this was unacceptable. And after discovering that, none of the law enforcement agencies were willing to take action on this, we went in and reclaimed the school. We knocked down walls. And as I was getting arrested by one of the, actually about 10 police officers out of the 60 that had been brought to protect this land grab, the officer in charge of the operation looked me in the face, and I think he must have forgotten he was on not just national television, but international television. BBC, South African Broadcasting, and various other agencies were there as well. He shouted at me, I can shoot you and I can kill you. And I said, no, you can't. There are too many cameras. I didn't get shot. I got thrown into the back of a police van and then spent the night with Boaz Waruku, my colleague who was also there that day. And to some extent forgot about this officer. And then about 9 years later, I am now the director of Amnesty International Kenya. I'm at the Prosecutors Training Institute. And somebody walks up to me and says to me, good afternoon, Mr. Irũngũ. You won't remember me, but I was the officer in charge of the station at Langata. And I immediately realized this is the same officer. So we had a conversation about this, and I learned a lot about, what human beings can be, which is that they are not fixed. They don't have fixed roles. They don't have fixed identities. They have the capacity for transformation and change. And I asked him, what would have happened if you had shot me that day? They wouldn't be the opportunity for this conversation. He said, I thought I was just doing my job. I didn't realize that I was actually facilitating a crime as a police officer. So, one of the things that I try to bring to my work, which I think is consistent with Landmark, is this idea that there are no fixed positions. There are no, there is no binary. There's not an us and a them. There is essentially human beings being who they are. And that's not fixed or unchangeable. That can always change with the right conversation. And I'm just glad in this particular context, we were able to develop a new relationship 10 years later. I actually met him in court the other day, and he took me aside and gave me a bit of advice, which was very helpful for a case that we were prosecuting, which was actually a habeas corpus case. He's a very senior police officer now working for the government of Kenya, and I do believe, despite that moment, is a decent man.
Well, you brought up Landmark several times, and for somebody listening or watching who is not familiar with Landmark, that's a commonality for all the people we interview. They've participated in Landmark, and I did want to ask you how Landmark has supported you and what you're doing, but I think I could be more specific. There's this idea that you can create a possibility in sharing with another person that moves them, that touches them, that inspires them, that calls them to act. People get a lot of training in being able to speak and listen in a way that elicits that. But I also think that, for many people, when faced with, the kind of fear that goes along with being arrested or possibly being killed, that maybe that's too serious for that to apply, but that doesn't seem to be the case with you.
I mean, Landmark works on all kinds of things, right? So I did the Landmark Forum in 2005. I was 2 years into my dream job. I had, over the 2 years, gone from a dream job to a nightmare job. I really had it that this wasn't the place for me. I'd written a resignation letter and went into the Landmark Forum, essentially to work on my first marriage, which was crumbling at that time. And what I got out of it was, insights, not just for my marriage, but even for my job, which was essentially that I was 100% responsible for turning around my job, not somebody else. And I had spent all the time complaining about this person, that person, this person. walked into the office on Monday morning after the forum and went up and apologized to my director and said, listen, I've been a jerk. I've had it that you're a particular way, and it has nothing to do with anything we've ever done. It's purely, my listening for you. And I give it all up, and I really apologize. And 4 hours later, she called me and said, listen, we've not been able to spend all the money that we had allocated for South Sudan. Would you like, I think it was then about $50,000 for your program? Do you have an idea of how you could use that? And I immediately wrote up a concept note, and my program budget doubled by, threefold, right? So it's not just, for the more difficult, risky work that we do. That photograph that's come up now, let me just share a little bit about that photograph. I'm smiling, but what you don't see is I'm trying to protect 6 body bags that have been dragged out of a quarry in a place called Quarry, which is in Nairobi. And the community are furious. They are so angry that they want to stone the police that are trying to recover these bodies for criminal investigations. And I and a few people, not more than 10 people, are standing between, a crowd of about maybe 800 people and 6 police officers, 4 of whom had automatic rifles, but were completely outnumbered, couldn't use them. And my role was essentially to protect the 5 or 6 bodies and the police officers so that they could take this evidence to the mortuary and we could try and figure out who was killing these women. This was a multiple, mass fatality incident that we thought was connected to the protests in July, I believe. So, there is possibility in every moment. And I think essentially what I've picked from Lamarck has been, that by staying in the present and creating a powerful context for yourself, you can impact in a context that just has no listening for you. I mean, it's just not, that doesn't make sense that afternoon. I would say more, but I suspect I will be accused by my counsel of essentially providing, or rather spreading vicarious trauma to everybody that's watching this. So I'm just going to stop there. But it's been a really wonderful set of tools for me. From giving up complaints to giving up filters for people, speaking to the better side, or creating people in front of me and speaking to them in the way that I think they could show up in this moment. And it has been truly transformational in many contexts.
We talked earlier, you said something I wrote down: showing up consistently for others gives you a life worth living. And I hear that in what you just shared. If you look for a moment, just, there's a hypothetical person listening right now that wants to get involved, that they want to step up and do more, and that maybe they're reticent, maybe they're concerned, maybe they're worried. What would you say to them?
Well, actually, it is the question that I ask every day. Amnesty is not a non-governmental organization in truth, really. It is actually a movement of individuals who are doing things that matter to them. They are working on cases around femicide, the violence against women. They're working on protection of children from predators. They're working on digital safety online. It, for us, doesn't really matter so much what the issue is. It just matters that you are beginning to create, circles of protection, circles of awareness in the space that you are. So the question that I would ask you, if you were listening to me today, is the same question I would ask our members. What matters to you? What of all the things that you see going on in this country of yours, whether it be in the United States of America or Kenya, is it corruption? Is it, the lack of protection for refugees? Is it extrajudicial killings? Is it enforced disappearances? Is it medical negligence? Is it, patients being chained to their beds because they can't afford to pay the bills for their life-saving surgery? Whatever it is, pick one issue or several issues and begin to work on them. And then the next obvious question is, how can I help?
Yeah, just to go back for a moment, this idea of creating a possibility that inspires other people. one of there's a lot of tactics that people employ in protesting and attempting to affect change and attempting to, shift the government's mindset. And, there's a lot of language that we use around, protesting, fighting for something, stopping something, ending something, resisting something. And, at different times, all tactics are useful. But there's something that I hear in what you're sharing about Amnesty and really, I think, perhaps more specifically, your view that is beyond tactics, that what affects the ultimate change that you're out to cause, it's as I said, it's beyond the tactics. What would you say?
Yeah, there were moments of discomfort when I joined Amnesty. The one of those moments was the overuse of naming and shaming, right? So we were cancel culture 101 way before I think the youngest of our generations began to use it, and I find it very uncomfortable, right? I find you know the idea that you have to shame somebody to get them to do the right thing, to be, I think it's just flawed as an idea. I think what's really powerful is thinking about what is it that matters to that person, and then creating a bridge between what they're doing and what matters to them, and get them to understand, that what they're doing is antithetical, or it is the opposite of what matters to them, and then watching them beginning to realize that actually, there is humanity over there where they are violating human rights. I mean, just give you an example. So over the last couple of years, so let me just start with a bit of a background. Let me start with the obvious things. There have been gay people in Kenya from time immemorial. Our grandmothers will tell us that they were same-sex relationships way before the colonials came. The legislation that is on our statute books to criminalize same-sex, relationships, or even intercourse between two men, is essentially colonial laws. It's part of the penal code that was brought in the 1950s. And more recently, what we've started to see is a deliberate whipping up of hate speech and hatred against lesbians, gays, and homosexuals and transgender persons. And this is one of the biggest, kind of concerns that we've had for a minority population for some time. Over the last year and a half, we've seen about 12 public hate rallies take place across 3 of our biggest cities. We've seen over 1,500 human rights violations, and they can be anything from, firing, dismissing people because of their sexuality or their gender orientation, or evicting them from their homes, or beating them up and assaulting them, or worse still, even killing them. And I think what we as Amnesty have continued to remind people is that there is nothing, very different from targeting a gay person than there is from targeting a woman because of her gender, or targeting a child because you want to inherit the land that is going to bequeath to that because they're in the patrilineal line, and therefore 18 years later, this child will gain access to a small piece of land. There's nothing different from, violating the rights of refugees. And I think when you come at the conversation from this universal perspective, people get it. They get that actually, a gay person shouldn't be thrown out of their home, thrown out of their job because of the choices they're making. And as I keep reminding people, right, most of us, our bedrooms are just too small for the government to climb into our bedrooms, right? So we don't need government in our bedrooms telling us what we should do and what we shouldn't do, as long as it's consensual and it doesn't break, any existing laws. That should not be the case. So I think, what I have been really looking for is narratives and language that is inclusive, that is oppositional, and gives people the opportunity to really search themselves. And, as we know, many of us adopt positions that we've never really interrogated for ourselves. We were socialized into those positions. And once we began thinking about it, like, why does it bother me so much whether a man wants to wear a skirt or a woman wants to wear trousers? And both of those at some point were equally offensive. Now it's not so offensive for women to wear skirts, for women to wear trousers. And I think, there'll become a time when, it won't even turn our eyes. And actually, funny enough, in Kikuyu custom, the community that my mother came from, men used to wear something close to skirts, in fact, close to dresses. And in some cases, they still do. But somehow it's got criminalized over the years. So I think speaking to the middle and speaking across the binaries has really helped us to create a society where everybody has a place, everybody is safe.
Well, you're pointing to something because you can. There's a movement back to, using air quotes, traditional values across a lot of societies. You can see that in the United States. You can see that in India. You can see that in, various places in Africa. It's a global phenomenon, and in some ways, people that have stood for this evolution of rights, this evolution of consciousness about the experience of others, people that you don't know, might feel like there's a backslide, that there's there's enough pushback that the idea of advancing rights is going backwards. What would you say to somebody who is experiencing the state of the world that way?
The Amnesty World Report that comes out every April this year, very empirically showed that we're starting to see mass fatalities from conflicts, places like Gaza. We're starting to see Sudan, also the Democratic Republic of Congo, masses of people, millions of people in flight from their homes because it's just not safe to stay there anymore. You're seeing backsliding of legal frameworks, laws that 10 years ago we fought to have in place in the US, the Roe versus Wade, framework that has governed reproductive health in the United States, has been challenged in several states. I think, all of this is true. I would caution people not to think of this as going back to something, but really look at it from a perspective of where are we in the present and where are we leaning into? Because I think there is a danger to miss the strengths and the capacities that exist as a result of the civil rights movements in all our countries. And we had national liberation movements in Africa. I see ourselves, really thinking about how do we take forward, some of the energy, some of the resistance, the love of freedom, the free expression into the future, and therefore not try and take us back to a mental model that nothing ever changed, or worse still, we're back in the past. About 4 years ago, in the middle of COVID, and COVID, of course, was a very scary time for all of us, and it hasn't quite disappeared because we still see some lingering signs of this in different parts of the world. It suddenly occurred to me that the government had failed to look for the remaining members of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the Mau Mau, the veterans who had waged, a war really to defeat a very powerful British Empire. And as we talked about the elderly being the most vulnerable and those that had underlying comorbidity issues, nobody had reached out to them and invited them to come forward and be vaccinated. So I tracked down the Secretary General of the Mau Mau Veterans Association, Gitawaka Hengere, and I said to him, he's probably about 97 years of age now, and I said to him, would you be vaccinated if I could arrange it? And I said, would you be willing to do this publicly to encourage elderly people to come forward and vaccinate? And he said, yeah, absolutely. So a car was arranged. I met him at a level 4 hospital just outside of Nairobi near his home. And without telling him, I got the Secretary General of the Kenya Medical Union to come and vaccinate him. And I said, nobody is going to vaccinate this old Shuja of ours, Shuja means, hero. You're going to do it as the Secretary General of the Medical Union. And he said, of course, what time, when? And they were side by side. And as he was being vaccinated by the Secretary General of the Medical Union, so on behalf of all the doctors in the country, the Mau Mau Secretary General said, we went to the forest to fight for a time just like this, so that our children could vaccinate us against a virus that is so small, so puny, but has the power to wipe out nations. And, I'm still moved by that moment because, it was just like 60 years just coming. And I don't think it's full circle, but if you get what I'm saying, it's just like that struggle created the conditions for a group of medical professionals to protect Kenyans in ways that the Mau Mau had done 60 to 70 years before then.
Well, the thing that really strikes me about that story is there's a commonality that's exists between all people. You talked earlier about speaking to the middle. But what I hear in what you've shared in our conversation so far is that there's something that's available for people to discover about that commonality.
This again is probably one of the other powers. If there's some superpowers that we've talked about this evening, it is the power of curiosity, remaining curious and really boldly disputing any sense that there are statics, that there are absolutes, but really in the curiosity, in the search and the discovery, there is power, and therefore not being resigned, not even remaining attached to anything, but really just being committed to a country in which all are safe, all are dignified, and all have a place to serve, is really where the power lies. And I think it's been 6 years since I've worked on Amnesty, and I just every day I find myself discovering something new about humanity, about who we are and why we exist, and what potentially we can do in a world that desperately needs leadership and ethics and transformation. And I think that's another power. I think remaining curious is where the power lies. Particularly, actually, if I think about it, Seamus, so I don't know if the US is like Kenya at the moment, but we're grappling a lot with mental health issues, well-being issues, suicides. And only yesterday we were talking with some friends, my wife and I, and they were talking about how they grapple almost on a weekly basis with their children who are in their 20s and have really come to a point where they think, that they will never get work. They will never find somebody who loves them. They will never be comfortable. And how difficult that is to be a parent at these times. But, imagine how difficult that is to be that child, to be that young adult, to be that impossible leader that's out there that is always struggling with self-esteem. And I think, the thing about curiosity is it always tells you that it's not over yet. It's not over, right? Whatever you think about the world, you think about yourself, think about the relationships around you, that's all up for grabs. It's all up for change. And therefore, just keep showing up every day. And you will see things that you thought were immutable, that were never going to change before your eyes. And you might even not notice it, but you will be in a different space, moment by moment, day by day, but definitely year by year.
That's just for your lips to God's ears.
And back to us, right?
And back to us, yes. I'm just looking again at what I wrote down. Showing up consistently for others gives you a life worth living. And I think that I was going to ask you the question, what would you say to that generation? But that, I think, encapsulates it. Well, there's one question that we ask people, everybody, as part of the interview, which is, just kind of, all of us in 100 years, we won't be here. And I'd like you just to look. What do you want people to say about you when you're no longer here?
That's an interesting one. I grew up with this thought a little bit, and there was a time when I was in my 20s, I actually thought I wasn't going to live until my 30s. And here I am, 58, and slightly surprised with the possibility of another 20 years, 30 years if my body doesn't give up before me. And one of the challenges I had when I was 25 was who's going to write my eulogy, right, or the obituary. And how it occurred to me then was that my life was spread out across different parts of the world. I had studied in the UK, I'd studied in Tanzania, I was moving back to Kenya. I had lots of relationships, done lots of stuff that was not on Facebook or anything like Facebook in those days. And I was just kind of worried about this. And then it occurred to me that actually that's not my role. So I think if it's not a cop-out, I would probably say it's actually not for me to tell you or anybody what they should what they should write about me then. I think I would leave that to history and to future generations to write about it. The only thing I probably would say is that I explore different forms of technology, social media platforms, X. I joined TikTok again. I'm terrified, but I realized that if I want to be relevant and connected to a younger generation in their 20s, I have to join this crazy thing called TikTok, where it seems to me that it's a recipe for damaging my well-being. But I think for me, it's just to, I write a column every week, 680 words. It started as a joke 6 years ago, and I've done probably about 500 opinion editorials every week. It takes me about 90 minutes now. I promise, and I don't know how long I'll hold out, but I don't use artificial intelligence for any of it. All of it is authentic intelligence, and it's really a love letter to all those people out there that want to make a difference on issues as diverse as maternal health to issues around refugee protection and more recently. And I curate them on a website. I hope that one day people will be able to come back to those writings and all the stuff that's on the internet and the book behind me and form their own obituary, form their own eulogy. I don't know if I've popped out on your question, but
there's no right answer to that question.
That would be my only expectation.
There's no right answer to that question. That was perfect. I just have to say it's really just been an enormous privilege to be able to have this conversation with you and just to be in the presence of the way you relate to the world is a lesson. And it's really a gift, for all of us. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Seamus, for the opportunity really to kind of share and hopefully provoke some thinking. The power of sharing showed up for me very vividly in the Introduction Leaders Program. And, I really got the power of humanity and being able to tell our own stories in the way that others can relate to them and take lessons for themselves to create lessons for others, really. Thank you.
Well, it's just really, thank you.